The dust of the Jezreel valley still clung to his clothes, fine reddish-brown particles that felt like grit against his parched skin. But the true dryness was deep within his lungs, an absence of hope that no amount of running could clear. It was not the memory of the fire that burned him, but the chilling realization of what had come after. Just days ago he had stood on Mount Carmel, a solitary figure mocking 450 prophets of Baal. He had called down judgment from heaven, and the very stones of the altar, along with the water soaked into the trench, had been consumed in a glorious, undeniable inferno. It was the absolute zenith of his ministry, the moment where the power of the living God manifested so visibly that the people fell on their faces, crying, "The Lord, He is God." That moment should have changed everything. It should have ushered in an era of repentance, an overthrow of the wicked regime, a cleansing of the nation. Instead, the queen, Jezebel, had simply sent a messenger, a chillingly calm threat delivered with surgical precision. "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." This was the ultimate betrayal of expectation. After witnessing the absolute sovereignty of the Almighty, after being the conduit of such terrifying, beautiful power, the world had not bent. It had simply doubled down on its malice. Now Elijah was running, not jogging, not a hasty retreat, but a desperate, lung-searing flight for survival, driven by a fear so profound it shattered his identity. He had just confronted the spiritual powers of darkness and won. Now he was terrified of one angry, determined woman. This psychological whiplash, the shift from divine authority to mortal terror, was the source of his current agony. He felt like a hollowed-out shell, a vessel that the power of God had used and then abandoned on the roadside. He ran far south, past Beersheba, leaving the familiar borders of Israel entirely, plunging himself into the raw, trackless wilderness of Judah. Each footfall was a testament to his overwhelming sense of failure, not just as a prophet, but as a man who had staked his entire existence on the unwavering efficacy of God's intervention. Where was the consuming fire now? Why was the protection that had incinerated water not shielding him from a single human agent? The answers did not come, only the suffocating silence of the wilderness, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breath. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, carrying the crushing weight of a failed revival, a triumphant moment that had led only to exile and the cold, hard fact that his enemies still reigned supreme. He wondered, with a cynicism born of spiritual exhaustion, if the fire of Carmel had simply been a cosmic joke, a momentary flare that highlighted the pervasive, stubborn darkness. This was not the struggle of a man who doubts God exists. It was the agony of a man who believes deeply but feels utterly discarded by the God he serves. The physical flight was nothing compared to the spiritual retreat he was executing, pulling the shutters down on his faith, seeking only oblivion in the unforgiving sun.
The journey deeper into the desolate landscape became a brutal mirror reflecting his internal state. For an entire day he pushed through the wilderness beyond Beersheba, a vast, arid expanse where the only companionship was the relentless searing heat and the occasional mocking whisper of the wind over the dry stones. His strength, which had seemed superhuman atop Carmel, was now just rapidly evaporating moisture and strained muscle fiber. Every step was a deliberation, a painful negotiation with his own failing body. He had brought nothing for this extended flight, no provisions, no water skins, just the tattered remnants of his prophetic mantle and the burning conviction that his life was forfeit. His mind, deprived of sleep and nourishment, began to play cruel tricks. He saw Jezebel's sneering face in the shimmering mirages on the horizon, heard the clatter of chariot wheels in the distant wind, and felt the sharp, imaginary bite of the executioner's sword against his neck. The fear was no longer just about survival. It had mutated into a deep-seated spiritual nausea, a rejection of the harsh reality that he, Elisha, the champion of the covenant, was reduced to a frightened fugitive. The anger began to rise, a bitter metallic taste in his throat, directed not at Jezebel, but at the divine architect who had seemingly orchestrated this magnificent failure. Why invest so much power? Why deliver such a promise of change, only to let it dissipate like morning fog when confronted by mere human wickedness? He remembered the awe of the crowds, the momentary thrill of knowing that the cosmos was answering his prayer, and contrasted it with the gnawing hunger in his belly and the agonizing dryness of his mouth. This life, this continuous battle against overwhelming odds had become intolerable. He had carried the mantle of God's glory, yet the reward was exhaustion and a death sentence. He felt profoundly misled, like a soldier who charges the enemy lines, only to look back and see his own general abandoning the field. The exhaustion was so complete that the desire for death was no longer a dramatic thought, but a simple, practical necessity, the only logical conclusion to this failed mission. He envied the prophets of Baal he had slain. At least their end had been swift and definitive. His was a slow, agonizing disintegration under a sun that felt like the eye of an indifferent God. The wilderness offered no sanctuary, only a confirmation of his ultimate solitude. He finally collapsed beneath the meager shelter of a solitary broom tree, Retham, its sparse branches offering a negligible shield against the midday sun. It was the perfect place for an ending, insignificant, remote, utterly unremarkable. He didn't seek a dramatic cave or a grand precipice. He sought anonymity in the dust. The exhaustion had finally eclipsed the fear, replacing the adrenaline with a heavy, leaden resignation. He lay down, his body protesting every movement, and addressed the heavens, not in the thunderous, commanding voice of Mount Carmel, but in a whisper, raw with defeat. This was the prayer of utter brokenness, a confession of theological despair. "It is enough, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This statement was far more than a request for death. It was a profound declaration of inadequacy. He was stating that all his miraculous efforts, all his zeal, all the visible evidence of divine favor, had amounted to nothing more than the ordinary eventual failure of every prophet and servant who had come before him. He had failed to turn the tide. The darkness was winning, and his light had been extinguished. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the realization that even with God on his side, man's capacity for evil and inertia was simply too great.
The deep theological crisis here was the realization that he had equated divine power with immediate, comprehensive success. And when that success didn't materialize, he mistakenly believed the power itself had been withdrawn. He had run 200 miles fueled by the conviction that God was finished with him, that the covenant had been broken, and that his life, once dedicated to a grand narrative, was now merely a loose thread waiting to be snipped. The pain was not just physical thirst, but the spiritual thirst for validation, for a sign that his sacrifices had mattered. And in this desert, under this wretched tree, he received no sign, only the echo of his own desperation. His request was almost gentle, a tired concession to reality. He wasn't demanding a miracle. He was asking for permission to surrender. He closed his eyes, intending for the silence of the wilderness to become his tomb, hoping that the exhaustion would lead swiftly to the quiet oblivion he craved, finally free from the impossible weight of being the Lord's sole advocate in a world determined to forget him. He surrendered to the darkness, letting the heavy curtain of sleep, which felt indistinguishable from death, descend upon him, wishing he would never wake to the painful reality of a world still governed by Jezebel and Baal.
The sleep that followed was not the refreshing balm of true rest, but the shallow, fitful unconsciousness of an utterly depleted body. Yet it offered a brief cessation from the relentless treadmill of his thoughts. When he was finally stirred, it was not by the harsh glare of the sun or the biting sand, but by an unfamiliar, incredibly gentle touch. He blinked open his eyes, disoriented, and saw not the spectral image of Jezebel, but an angelic messenger standing near his head. This was not the expected apocalyptic vision of glory or a terrifying confrontation. It was a quiet, practical intervention. The angel spoke only 2 words, soft and imperative: "Arise and eat." Near him, miraculously placed in the dust, were 2 objects that spoke volumes about the nature of God's immediate response to his despair. There was a cake baked on hot stones, still warm, and a jar of fresh water. This moment is critical because God did not immediately address Elijah's spiritual crisis, his suicidal ideation, or his failed theology. He addressed his physical, fundamental human need. Elijah was not confronted, corrected, or chastised. He was fed. He was treated first as a hungry, exhausted man, not just a failed prophet. The priority of the divine intervention was sustenance. The act of eating was almost mechanical, an instinctual reaction to the smell of bread and the sight of water, forcing the reality of the present moment over the desire for death. He consumed the simple meal not out of joy, but out of necessity, feeling the first trickle of energy returning to his starved system. Once the meal was finished, the angel, without further speech, let him return to sleep. The silence surrounding the intervention was as important as the food itself. There was no demand for explanation, no theological debate, just quiet care. When he woke a second time, the angel was there again, repeating the command, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." It was a gentle warning, a recognition that the path ahead, whatever it was, required strength he did not yet possess, and that this strength had to be supernaturally supplied. He ate the second meal, the power of which transcended mere calories.
It was the bread of affirmation, confirming that even in his profoundest moment of failure and self-rejection, he was not forgotten. This divine provision was not about changing his circumstances instantly, but about preparing him for the journey through them. The simple, humble miracle of baked bread and cold water spoke louder than the fire of Carmel. It spoke of intimate, enduring love that cared for the fragile human being beneath the heavy mantle of prophecy.
Fortified by the two miraculous meals, Elijah began a new journey, one that was not flight, but purposeful migration. He walked for 40 days and 40 nights, covering the immense distance to Horeb, the mountain of God, also known as Sinai, the place where the covenant had been forged in thunder and smoke centuries earlier. That solitary march, powered solely by the grace provided under the broom tree, was itself a profound spiritual exercise. It was a 40-day walk through the valley of the shadow, sustained by a single source of hope. He wasn't walking toward a solution. He was walking toward a confrontation with the source of his calling, driven by a deep, subconscious need to ask God, face to face, what had gone wrong. The journey was grueling, a relentless test of endurance in a landscape that grew ever more severe, but the bread held him together, a physical manifestation of a promise: you will not starve, even when you wish to die. Upon reaching Horeb, he found refuge in a cave, a dark, protective hollow in the very rock that had once trembled at God's voice. He was seeking sanctuary, but also a reckoning. It was here, in this cold, silent chamber, high on the sacred mountain, that the divine presence finally spoke, not in thunderous command, but in a simple, direct question that cut through all his layers of self-pity and despair. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a question that demanded accountability, not accusation. It implied, you were called to be in the land, confronting evil. This is not the battleground I assigned you. Explain yourself. This was the moment the dark night of the soul transitioned from internal struggle to external dialogue. Elijah was being asked to articulate the pain that had driven him hundreds of miles into exile, to put words to the complex theological and emotional crisis he was undergoing. He was on the very mountain of God, and yet he felt profoundly abandoned. His answer, when it came, would not be a prayer, but an indictment. This sense of profound isolation and the search for an explanation in the very heart of the divine presence is something every weary soul recognizes. When you have done everything right, borne every burden faithfully, and the result is crushing failure and exile, where do you run? You run to the source, demanding answers from the only one capable of giving them, even if you fear the silence more than the response. It is the moment we stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "Why this way?" It is the moment we demand validation for our suffering. I want to pause here for just a moment, because this is where the story shifts from the prophet's journey to the core of the human experience. When you have faced your own moments of utter failure, or when you felt your faithfulness earned you nothing but suffering, where did you seek refuge? Was it in quiet withdrawal, or did you, like Elijah, march straight back to the source, determined to get an answer? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Your journey is part of this larger parable of endurance. Elijah had reached the holy ground, but his expectation was fear and judgment. He prepared his defense, ready to argue his case before the cosmic judge, utterly convinced that his zealous efforts had earned him a better fate than hiding in a cave. Elijah delivered his response, a carefully constructed summary of his martyrdom and his solitude. It was not a humble response. It was the outpouring of a soul deeply wounded and fiercely righteous. He repeated his answer twice, once here in the cave and again later after the divine demonstration, emphasizing the permanence of his conviction. I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Every phrase was loaded with bitterness and self-justification. He wasn't just stating facts, he was building a case. I am zealous, unlike others. The people have failed completely. They are guilty. I am the last one standing. My sacrifice is unique. I am about to die. I deserve intervention or rest. He was expressing the ultimate pain of the faithful servant, the feeling of being the only one holding the line, fighting a losing battle, and feeling utterly unappreciated by the commander he serves. He felt betrayed by the very people he fought for, and worse, abandoned by the God who had sent him. His despair was rooted in comparison, comparing the magnitude of God's power, witnessed at Carmel, to the magnitude of the resulting threat, Jezebel's successful pursuit. The dissonance was deafening. He had risked everything, and the reward was a deeper isolation. This deep sense of being the only one left is the hallmark of the dark night, a spiritual arrogance woven deeply with genuine pain. It convinces the soul that its suffering is unique, its fight singular, and therefore its abandonment absolute. Elijah had defined his entire worth by his output, his success in confronting idolatry. And when that output failed to produce the expected systemic change, his entire identity collapsed. He saw himself as indispensable, and therefore God's failure to protect him completely felt like a failure of divine management. He was ready to accept death, but he needed God to acknowledge the gravity of the loss. He needed God to say, "Yes, Elijah, you were the greatest, and it is a tragedy that you must fall." He was demanding validation for his despair, wanting God to confirm the narrative that the world was too evil and that the mission had truly failed. He waited, his ears straining, convinced that the next sound would be the voice of God confirming the terrible truth. The task was too great even for me, and now you can rest. But God's response would not be a validation of his despair. It would be an invitation to step out of the darkness and witness a completely different manifestation of divine presence. The instruction came, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." This was not an order for battle, but an order for observation. Elijah emerged from the cave, shielded from the immediate presence of the divine, bracing himself for the cataclysmic display of power he associated with the mountain of covenant. He expected the fire, the smoke, the terrifying sound of the trumpet, the grandeur that speaks of judgment and cosmic authority. And God delivered exactly that, but with a critical distinction. First came the great and strong wind, so violent it ripped apart the mountains and shattered the rocks before the Lord. It was a terrifying force, raw and destructive, shaking the foundations of Horeb. Elijah watched, his breath caught in his throat, expecting the voice of God to ride the gale. But the text makes a vital clarification. But the Lord was not in the wind. Next, immediately following the wind's cessation, the mountain shuddered with a massive earthquake. The ground beneath Elijah's feet buckled and rolled, a dizzying display of tectonic power. The earth itself was protesting, groaning under the weight of the divine passage. This was the pure, uncontrollable might that could topple kingdoms and swallow armies. Yet again the message was clear, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then, after the ground settled and the air grew still for a moment, a fire erupted. Not a contained, altar-consuming fire like Carmel, but a devastating, roaring conflagration that swept across the peaks, symbolizing purification and wrath. This was the fire Elijah often called down, the fire he understood, the visible sign of absolute holiness. He hid his face, anticipating the command, the judgment, the declaration of war against Jezebel that he craved. Yet for the third time, but the Lord was not in the fire. God was systematically showing Elijah all the ways he could manifest, all the spectacular, terrifying power that Elijah assumed was necessary to fix the world and to defeat his enemies, and yet dismissing each one as the core of his current presence. Elijah, in his despair, was looking for a spectacular intervention, a force that would obliterate Jezebel and vindicate his isolation. He wanted God to meet his anger with proportional vengeance. But God was teaching him a profound, counterintuitive lesson. The absence of overwhelming public destruction does not equate to the absence of God. The power that defines him is not always the power that shatters mountains. Following the dramatic, destructive passage of the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, a total, pregnant silence descended upon the mountain. The air was no longer thick with smoke or vibrating with seismic shock. It was utterly still. And then, from this absolute silence, came a sound so delicate, so subtle, that it challenged every assumption Elijah held about divine communication. It was described in the ancient Hebrew as a kol dinmama dakah, often translated as a still small voice, but more accurately rendered as the sound of thin stillness, or a sound of gentle silence. It was not an audible roar. It was the audible texture of profound peace and quiet presence. It was the sound that comes after the world stopped screaming. This moment was the pivot point of Elijah's dark night. He had been looking for God in the chaos, the power, the judgment, the events that matched his own internal fury and despair. He wanted God to confirm that the situation was indeed catastrophic and required cosmic vengeance. But God came in the opposite of what he expected. He came in the vulnerability of quietness. This gentle sound forced Elijah to move beyond his expectations of grandeur and confront a radical truth. God's presence, especially in times of profound spiritual crisis and emotional exhaustion, is often found not in the spectacular events that dominate headlines, but in the mundane, intimate whispers that require intentional listening. When Elijah heard this sound, this gentle stillness, he finally understood the nature of the encounter. He wrapped his face in his mantle, not in fear of destruction, but in reverence for this unexpected intimacy. The powerful Elijah, who had stood bare-faced before the consuming fire on Carmel, now hid his face before the sound of stillness. He recognized that this quiet presence was more profound, more demanding, and ultimately more comforting than any tempest could ever be. It signified that God was neither absent nor indifferent. He was simply present in a mode that Elijah, blinded by his despair and his expectation of immediate comprehensive victory, had failed to recognize. The abandonment Elijah felt was not God leaving the scene. It was God refusing to perform the expected dramatic rescue, instead offering a deeper, quieter, sustaining presence that honored Elijah's need for rest and intimate connection over his desire for spectacle and vengeance. The lesson was clear. The way out of the dark night is not found in the thunderous validation of your anger, but in the quiet acceptance of God's sustaining gentleness.
Once the gentle stillness settled, the divine presence returned to the question, repeating it precisely as before, allowing Elijah a final opportunity to articulate his pain after witnessing the profound shift in divine manifestation. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah, perhaps chastened by the revelation, but still deeply entrenched in his sorrow, repeated his exact complaint, word for word. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." This repetition is telling. Even after the spiritual balm of the stillness, the factual reality of his isolation and danger had not changed. His circumstances were still dire. But notice what God did not do. God did not argue with Elijah's facts. God did not condemn his despair. God did not say, "You should have more faith," or "You are being overly dramatic." He simply accepted the wounded premise and responded with a plan of action and a profound revelation of hidden grace. The response was multifaceted, offering both purpose and perspective. First, the plan. God gave him specific, immediate tasks that required him to leave the cave and re-engage with the world. He was told to go anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as his successor. This task list was the absolute proof that Elijah's mission was not over, that his life was still valuable, and that God was already moving chess pieces behind the scenes. The way out of the dark night is always found in renewed purpose, a mandate that reminds the soul that it is still necessary. You are not meant to die in the cave. You are meant to return to the road, even if you are exhausted. Second, and perhaps most importantly, came the revelation that shattered his self-pitying solitude. "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah was not, in fact, the only one left. There were 7,000 others, hidden from his view, quietly enduring, faithfully serving, without fanfare or fire. His dark night had been exacerbated by the mistaken belief that he carried the entire burden of faithfulness alone. God revealed that the true work of the kingdom is often carried out not by the singular spectacular prophet, but by a network of hidden faithful believers, sustained by the same quiet grace Elijah had just experienced. This profound affirmation that he was part of a larger, unseen company immediately lessened the weight of his burden. He was not abandoned, he was just blinded by despair, focusing only on the visible enemy, Jezebel, and failing to see the invisible fellowship, the 7,000.
The path forward was not miraculous rescue, but acceptance of the mandate and the realization of his hidden support network.
The mandate given by the gentle voice transformed the trajectory of Elijah's remaining ministry. He left the cave, no longer running from fear, but walking toward purpose. The journey back was fundamentally different from his flight into the wilderness. He carried no grand sense of impending victory, but a quiet, solemn acceptance of his role in God's ongoing, slow-moving plan. The first act of recommissioning was the anointing of his successor, Elisha. This was the most challenging and yet most essential task. By anointing Elisha, Elijah was accepting the limits of his own physical and emotional endurance. He was admitting that the fight required continuity, not just singularity. He traveled back toward the fertile land and found Elisha not in a temple or a great school of prophets, but in the midst of ordinary labor, plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen. This image itself was a profound corrective to Elijah's despair. God's work was happening not just in firestorms and mountain caves, but in the quiet, necessary toil of the common man. The contrast between Elijah's dramatic isolation and Elisha's practical engagement in the world was striking. Elijah threw his mantle upon Elisha as he passed by, a simple, silent gesture that transferred the weight of the calling. Elisha understood immediately, leaving his oxen and running after Elijah. This moment of transition symbolized the end of Elijah's singular, lonely burden. He was no longer the sole torchbearer. He had found the companion and successor he desperately needed. The dark night of the soul thrives on isolation, convincing the sufferer that their pain is singular and their fight is unwitnessed. God's ultimate solution to Elijah's despair was not to remove the threat of Jezebel immediately, but to remove his isolation. By giving him Elisha, God provided companionship, shared burden, and the tangible proof that the mission would continue beyond his own strength or lifetime. The fear of failure, which had driven him to the broom tree, was countered by the promise of legacy. The anxiety of being the only one left was remedied by a concrete human partnership. Elijah's dark night, catalyzed by profound exhaustion and the feeling of abandonment, was not cured by a dramatic flash of fire, but by the quiet comfort of simple sustenance, a gentle stillness, and the humble realization that he had a partner waiting in the field. The way out of the darkness is rarely spectacular. It is usually practical, relational, and requires returning to the gentle rhythms of service, trusting that the stillness holds more power than the storm ever did, and that the quiet faithful outnumber the loud voices of malice and despair. His despair had been a form of spiritual burnout, and God responded not with judgment, but with companionship and the assignment of manageable, sequential tasks, pulling him gently back into the flow of life and ministry, one step at a time, away from the seductive inertia of the cave and back into the dusty reality of the world that still desperately needed his voice, even if it was quieter now, tempered by the stillness of Horeb and the shared yoke with Elisha. He had faced his death wish, and God had answered with life, hidden in bread and friendship. This was the true miracle, far exceeding the drama of the fire on Carmel,
a miracle of quiet, sustaining grace that proved presence even in profound absence of expected comfort and power, moving him towards the eventual triumphant end to his journey in a chariot of fire, an ending earned not by his initial zeal, but by his final humble endurance after the despair had passed, proving that even the most zealous servants require rest and reorientation, finding their strength not in their own fervency, but in the quiet steadfastness of the divine plan unfolding regardless of their feelings of failure. The darkness had been defeated not by fighting it, but by walking through it, leaning on the gentle sustenance provided on the path of return to service alongside the one God had prepared to walk with him, the young Elisha, waiting patiently in the field, ready to shoulder the mantle of prophecy, ensuring that the legacy of faith would endure, a comforting truth that finally allowed the prophet's soul to rest even while his feet still walked the dusty roads of Israel under the shadow of Jezebel's continuing temporal power. The fight was not over, but the loneliness was ended, and that made all the difference.